Well, hey there, welcome back. So in this series, we're looking at the Gospels, and what I do on all of these episodes is try to tell the story behind whatever it is that's going on. So we'll talk about the Gospels in the coming weeks, and we'll look at some of the content of them, but what I'm more interested in, or what I want to focus more on, is the story behind them. How did they come into being? What's their context? What is the culture behind their creation? And in doing that, one, to give sort of a better understanding of what kind of documents these are, and hopefully to help you as a reader of the Gospels to better understand them, but to also hopefully answer some of the, I guess, criticisms, critiques against the Gospels, the questions around their supposed contradictions or their authenticity or their historical reliability and these sorts of things as well. So all of those questions, I think, can largely be answered when we understand them in the context that they were written in. So that's what we're trying to do here. And what we saw last week was the culture of memorization, or the oral culture that these Gospels were created in. So these are written in a time where there is far less reliance on writing, because most people can't write. What you're reliant on in this world is your memory. You're reliant on your ability to remember details and to use your brain in the same way that we use computers today. So in today's world, when we get important information, we store it on a hard drive, or we store it in the cloud, or we store it in photos. We don't commit very much to memory, and in some ways because there's so much information that we're needing to retain, but also because that's just the way that we work now. We work within this digital age, and what that relies on is a hard drive. It relies on computers and phones and these devices that enable us to not have to think, not have to carry these thoughts with us, because we've got them on recall in these computers and these devices that we have. So for us to really understand the world of the first century, we have to step out of that digital world and get back into a world that is reliant and that trains the human memory like a muscle to be effective, to be much more efficient. And even if you've never been to school, even if you've never had a formal education, and in your schooling, if you did have the opportunity to go to school, you will learn these memory exercises. Your memory will be trained in the same way that we would learn to use computers. Even if you never had that education, you're still going to have a sense of how to use that, because you're in a world that expects you, or you need to rely on that memory to be able to function in the world at every possible level. In the same way that you may not go and have a formal education on digital technology and computers, but you still have a basic understanding of how to use a phone, how to use a computer, because again, that's the world that we live in. We need to be able to function with these. So that's what your typical person is going to be. So even the most uneducated, unschooled fisherman is still going to know how to use their memories, because that's just simply what they have to do. That's how their world works, and their default is to use that. So that's just the way that this world is, and that's the world that these Gospels emerge from. And so it's a world that, as I say, it's an oral culture, which means that it doesn't place the same priority on writing. We think about, or we prioritize something being written down and recorded as being reliable. We're more hesitant to trust memory because we don't use them as much anymore. We don't practice our memories as much anymore. We consider them to be less trustworthy. We know that how easy things are to forget, or how easy things are to change in the telling and the retelling, and so we don't have the same faith in our memories as what these guys would. Whereas in that world, you're far more. There's far more trust, or there's far more authority placed on an oral tradition than there is on a written tradition. This is a world that places the highest priority on the traditions that have been faithfully passed down. And so if you're passing down a tradition, your obligation to it is to remember it faithfully as it's been passed down through the generations. So that's a very important part of what you do in the telling and the retelling of the stories. It's not just that you hear a few details and then they get messed up in your retelling, and it's a different story that you pass on, like Chinese whispers. There's much more concern, much more faithfulness to that tradition. And so writing, though it's a part of this world, it's not given the same authority. It's not as used as much, again, because not as many people can read and write. And so when you do write, it is generally used to help to aid memory. And so we'll find the writings of students who are taking a few notes to help trigger a deeper memory. But what the writing is doing is to help trigger a tradition that's been memorized. And so they'll spend the time and exercise their memories to learn ideas and philosophical concepts and teachings and these sorts of things. And they might write a few notes so as to trigger that. But it's not about writing it down and so you don't have to think about it anymore, so you don't have to remember it. You do still remember it, but the writing is there just to sort of give you sort of a prompt for all of that memory to come back. So when you take somebody like Paul, for example, who's traveling around the Roman Empire, he can't carry with him a Bible. Now, he's a teacher of Scripture. That's what his profession is. But he doesn't carry with him a Bible. He might have maybe a scroll or two and maybe a few notebooks. But what he has to be able to do is to recall the entirety of Scripture at any point that is required in his teaching. And so in order for him to do that, he has to memorize it. That has to be there on recall because he might be in a teaching situation or in a synagogue that doesn't have the particular scroll that he wants to quote from, be it Isaiah or one of the prophets or whatever it might be. They may not have a copy of that particular scroll. And so he needs to be able to still teach from it. Well, he's going to teach from it from memory. And so the priority again is for him to commit that to memory. Now, he will have some notebooks. And in fact, when he's writing to Timothy later on, he says, hurry and come to me and don't forget to bring my notebooks and my parchments. What they would be some collected ideas, maybe some sermon notes, maybe some ideas that he's written down or formulated, or maybe some scriptures that he's penned. But again, just triggers for bigger ideas that he would have developed and memorized and conceptualized. So writing and reading are there, but again, not the priority, even to the extent that when you read something, typically what is going to happen, and again, if you're the only people that can really read are wealthy people that have the time to do the reading. The reality is for most people, you're working all day, every day, 7 days a week, sunrise to sunset. You don't have the time to sit back and read. You don't have the time for that sort of leisurely life. In fact, interestingly enough, our word leisure, in the English word leisure, comes from the Greek word skole. So if we think about the word scholar, and so, a scholarly person, we think about some intellect or some sort of intellectual person. The Greek word skole literally means leisure. To be a scholar is literally to have a leisurely life. You have the time to read. You have the time to think because you don't have to work, because you're rich, because you've got slaves to do all the work for you. You don't have to work. In fact, it's seen as something of a discredit to your status or your pride that you would work with your hands. The ideal life is a life of leisure, to go to your beachfront resort or your beachfront villa and spend the time reading and learning and meditating. But you don't sit down and quietly read to yourself like we would pick up a book and go and sit in a nice comfortable chair. You have a slave read whatever it is to you. You have it read out to you because there's seen to be more sort of value or more profundity, I guess, in having the book read, in the same way that we might listen to an audiobook while we do something else, as opposed to sitting down and reading the hard copy. That becomes the priority. That's how people learn. That's how they ingest whatever it is, the books that they're reading. So it's an oral culture, and what that looks like then in reality particularly for teachers, is that you teach traditions. You have memorized traditions that are a part of your particular school. So if you look at the different philosophical schools, for example, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Peripatetics, these sorts of schools, they have their own traditions that originate back to their founders. So back to guys like Zeno, the founder of the school of Stoicism, for example. And they would have these established traditions that they've taught their students and that the students have memorized and then faithfully passed down, because your teacher's authority and your teacher's ideas are the foundation of the school that you're part of. And so you're going to be faithful to the way in which you memorize them. That's the highest priority, is to make sure you memorize them faithfully and then pass them on faithfully. It's not a case of Chinese whispers. Oh yeah, I think he sort of said something like this. Basically, the gist of it was this. No. You memorize it word for word. You memorize it verbatim, and that is the tradition you pass down. And so what you're going to find then with these teachers is that they formulate their ideas in ways that are easier to remember. Now, depending on the educational level of their students, they're going to formulate their ideas in ways that are easy, not just to remember, but to understand and to process. And so when we come to the Gospels, well, you can see this coming through on every page. When Jesus is teaching, he's teaching in parables. Why does he teach in parables? I mean, what's a parable? It's a story. It's just a short story with a philosophical or a moral point. So when you look at Jesus's audience, who are this sort of working class, people that are uneducated, people that aren't as sophisticated and well-trained as maybe the elite Pharisees were, he's teaching people that are just, they need to hear this, but they need it given to them in such a way that is easy for them to commit to memory. And so he'll use analogies or metaphors from fishing or from farming or from working in vineyards and these sorts of things. Why would he use those as your examples? Well, because he's talking to people who have vineyards and farmers and fishermen. He's talking to people working in those trades. And so he's using language or using a world that they're familiar with, a world that you don't need to explain how the world of fishing works to a fisherman. They live it every day. They know that world better than anybody else. And so it's like, well, okay, let's look at your world and let's add a metaphor in that, which has a deeper philosophical principle. So you understand how fishing works. You understand you throw in a net and you bring in fish. Well, I'm going to teach you how to do that, but your fish now are going to be men. Well, all that's changed in their thinking, the profound idea is men. How does that work? Well, it's a metaphor, but I understand the principle. And so Jesus teaches in parables because they're easy to remember. These are stories that are familiar to the people. They're what they're doing. I mean, the fact is, the people who are listening to these stories have probably going back to their farms once they've finished hearing Jesus talk to get back to the work that he's just been talking about. So naturally, that's going to be the way that you teach because that's the most easy way to remember it. And so there's an intentionality about these stories. They're not kids' stories. They're very profound, but they're packaged in a way that is much, much easier for these people to remember. So when we think about the early church then, what we need to picture is not a bunch of scholars sitting around poring over biblical texts. They were everyday people who were going about their lives, but were trying to live their lives according to a new set of principles or a new set of ideas. And in order for that to happen effectively, they needed to know what the core teaching was, what the core ideas were. And again, you can't expect them to remember, again, people that are not necessarily educated to remember long discourses of deep, complicated philosophical ideas. What you need to give them are shorter pieces of information, shorter traditions, but have within them or packaged in such a way that as you unpack them, the ideas all sort of are brought back to memory. So here's the bigger philosophical idea that I've been teaching you, but here it is packaged in such a way that the key points are there, that just by remembering these key points, all of the deeper content and information is going to come back to you, but the tradition itself, that's what you're memorizing. That's the word-for-word part that you're memorizing. So we actually see examples of this happening throughout our New Testaments, and particularly in 1 Corinthians. So we get a great example of this in 1 Corinthians 11:23. And it's Paul talking to the church there about communion and talking about a tradition that he passed on in the very earliest days of the church. And so what he would have done when he first got to Corinth is establish the regular weekly or the regular gathering of the whole church coming together for communion. And as a part of that procedure, as a part of that communion event, they would recite this tradition. this memorized tradition that he would have had them all commit to memory. But within that tradition is the bigger idea of what this gospel is all about. And so he reminds them of it again because they've clearly forgotten how to live out this tradition by the time Paul writes this letter. And so he's bringing them back to the first idea that he gave them and to say, guys, this is how far you've strayed from that original tradition. So it says, 1 Corinthians 11:23, he says, "For I received from the Lord what I passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me.'" So that's the tradition. And it's what it is the whole story of the Last Supper and everything that meal represents is what every meal afterwards is meant to represent as well. And so to reinforce that idea, that whole sort of structure around the meal, this is the tradition that it comes from. And so by reciting that tradition, which they probably would have done as a part of the communion meal, well, that's going to remind you of what this is all about. But what's really interesting later on is that when we read in Luke 22, we actually find word for word that same tradition. And I won't read it out because it's literally word for word. Luke 22, 19 to 20. It's literally word for word the tradition that we've just seen in Corinth. And we'll say, oh, well, yeah, obviously Paul got it from the gospel. No, because remember, the gospels are written after the letters. So Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about 54, and we can date Luke's gospel to maybe the late 70s at the earliest, maybe even the early 80s. And so quite some time after the writing of 1 Corinthians, but we find this word-for-word tradition literally in the Greek. It's the same wording of this tradition. And so one that tells us that these traditions are being memorized verbatim. It's important that they're memorized properly. But we can also see the source for Luke's gospel. He's not writing down some tape recording of an interview that he had with Jesus. Of course, that's ridiculous. Where Luke got his tradition from is from Paul, who was his teacher. And so Luke had never met Jesus, of course, but he'd met Paul, who'd memorized this tradition, passed it on to Luke. And so when Luke comes along later on to write down his gospel, and as we see, he's collected all of these sources from all of these different places, one of those sources being Paul himself, and one of those traditions that he's received is this one. And so he's naturally incorporated that word for word into his gospel because he himself would have memorized it from Paul in the same way that Paul had passed it on to the Corinthians. So this is just one example of what was a common practice in the early church, where they took the core ideas in memorized form, and that's what they gave the people, and that's what they took with them wherever they went. So as this gospel spread, what it spread in the form of was a set of traditions, a set of memorized traditions that wherever you go, wherever you meet Christians, the core of the idea the core teachings are always going to be the same because they all come back to this original source of these traditions. Okay, so then what we're dealing with, or what we're having to picture here, is a central source of the traditions that go back to the earliest days with Jesus, and the followers of Jesus memorizing or writing down these traditions as they remembered them from Jesus, and then agreeing as a team, basically as a core unit or a core group of the earliest followers. These are the traditions that we all agree on as being the centerpieces of this gospel that we're going to spread out. And so that's sort of what goes out, and we'll sort of see how that gets collected up later on. But where we're going to with this, where this eventually ends up, is in a set of gospels that are just a collection of these traditions that have been going on now for decades. Certainly in the case of Mark, our earliest gospel, at least 4 decades after the events that they're actually writing about. But it still maybe raises the question then, again, is memory trustworthy? Now, we've already seen how important memory was and the way that memory can be trained. And memory is today, it's still the same muscle. Humans haven't changed. The memory muscle is a very powerful thing, and trained properly can be incredibly effective and incredibly accurate. But the question still remains, can we trust the memories of the people who first saw Jesus as being reflected accurately later on in the stories themselves, in the Gospels themselves? Well, the first thing we have to sort of recognize is that what these memories are extremely profound events in the lives of real people. Now, I used the example last week of my grandfather who served 2 times in Vietnam, and the stories, the anecdotes that he would tell them with in such vivid detail because these memories for him are so profound. Literally being blown up and having two knee reconstructions as a result of that is going to really reinforce the power of that memory. That is, even if some of the finer, insignificant details might change, the core of the story absolutely is going to be fixed because, well, you don't forget something like that. And so when we look at what these gospel accounts are talking about, these are pretty remarkable events. These are events that are absolutely mind-blowing in the lives of these people. Think about the stories of the miracles and the exorcisms that took place, that people seen, in these incredible miraculous events happen. Those sort of things don't happen every day. In fact, they might only happen once in your life. And so when you see it, it's going to be pretty hard to forget. Now, if you've seen it every day, you might forget that, the number or the quality of each one. But to see something that profound, you're not going to forget that very easily. These aren't innocuous, Jesus got up one morning and had a coffee. Well, that's not a memory. That's just like that's like a day-to-day occurrence. But a miracle is something very different. So what you're remembering there is very profound, and that lots of people would have seen that had the same experiences in various places. That you've got to put some trust that there's somebody is at least recalling what they genuinely believed happened in that event. Or in some cases, these events are absolutely life-changing. Think about the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, the source for Lazarus' resurrection, the original source of that was Lazarus himself. If he was resurrected, then he was back alive. Now, he eventually would have died, of course, but he would have been the primary source for that story happening. And so when they went back to Lazarus and they said, hey, so, tell us what happened. Well, I was dead. Now I'm not. And it's like, well, how do you know you're dead? Well, here's my family. They were there. They can tell you I was dead, right? I mean, the people that were there, the people that experienced that would have been profoundly impacted by that. You don't forget that. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I was dead once. And then I came back to life, like forgetting a meal that you had once. No, you don't forget something like that. And the people around you don't forget that sort of event. So if you're going to go back to that source and hear that story, again, you got to at least trust that they genuinely believe that was the thing that happened to him. Now, these stories, again, are very emotional stories. The story of the crucifixion, right? You don't make that up for a start. I mean, that's the worst possible story to make up. If you're trying to get some credibility for your message, you don't make it the absolute worst possible message that anybody could handle. But that story in itself, you don't just go, oh, that's right, Jesus was crucified. No, that was the most profound moment that happened in the lives of his followers, to watch their teacher, their best friend, be executed. And to see that happen to him, and for his family to see that happen, and to stand at the feet of the cross and see that, you don't forget that you don't easily change the details in that. I mean, that is an absolutely profound story. I mean, think about your own life when you've lost a loved one, and particularly in tragic circumstances. I remember when my dad was killed in a plane crash 10 years ago now, actually. And I can still vividly remember the moment when I heard that news. I can remember exactly where I was sitting, and I'm sure it was the same for you. When these events happen, something burns in your memory. You don't forget those very easily. In fact, you remember them more vividly than you would pretty much every other detail of your life. And so, again, we're talking about events that are incredibly emotional, incredibly deeply, profoundly moving. Again, you don't forget that very easily. But then even more than that, these are events that took place in crowds. Right? It's not just like some secret, oh, there's like 3 of us and we saw it, but we can't, we could tell you, but then we have to kill you kind of secrecy. No, this was done in front of different crowds every day. People from all over Judea and all over Galilee were seeing these events happening all the time, hearing the teachings of Jesus. And, hundreds, if not thousands of people over the course of Jesus' ministry. There are a lot of witnesses seeing the same events. So even if you don't remember, even if just like one person saw it and maybe has a vague recollection, no, these are talking about hundreds of thousands of people who aren't just going to see that event and than just, oh, well, wasn't that just an interesting thing that happened today? No, they're going to go home and talk about it, because that's, in a world where your everyday existence is fishing or farming or doing these menial tasks every day, where nothing changes and everything's pretty boring. To have something like Jesus come along and do the things that he was doing, breaking bread and feeding 5,000, you're not just going to remember that, you're going to tell everybody about that. You're going to go back to your village and say, you'll never believe what I just saw. And then all these other people are going to want to come out and see it, in the same way that that's the woman in Samaria. She sees this incredible, profound has this encounter with Jesus. What is the first thing she does? She goes back to her village and she tells everybody about it. And we see this happen throughout the Gospel. So it's not even just that the person who saw it, can be the only one to testify to it. No, they go and spread that story, and then others will share in that story as well, be witnesses to that person's account. So these are stories that are spreading around amongst thousands of people, and they're all going to be the same stories. And so if you're going to make this up, or if you're going to, forget the details, well, there's a lot of factors involved there that you have to overcome before you can forget the core details or even change them so that they say something that wasn't actually what the original thing was in the first place. So all that to say that when we talk about memory, even the most poorly trained memory, seeing those sorts of things is going to have a pretty profound impact. Again, myself, in my life, I've never done memory exercises, right? That's not something that I've done, but I can tell you memories of things that have happened, and I can tell you them very accurately because, again, had such a profound impact on my life that those are trustworthy memories that I can share with you. And I'm sure in your life, you've got exactly the same things. So memory in this sense is trustworthy even amongst the most uneducated people, but even more so in a world that by default has trained itself to use its memories in powerful ways. Okay, so with that established, we can to a large extent trust the memories of these people. It's not that they're remembering something, or they're changing the details, or they forgot it and they're making it. No, you can trust that they are recounting things that they genuinely remember. Now, if they're telling false stories, that's a different thing to remembering something differently, or the memory being changed as it goes down through the generations or down through the so-called Chinese whispers. That's a different thing to telling false stories. And that's not what look, they could all be lying, but everybody would be in on the lie, which is a lot of people that you have to convince that this is the lie that we're trying to tell. So that doesn't seem plausible. What seems plausible more so is that these are accounts of people who genuinely remember these particular events taking place. So that sort of, I think, hopefully gives some sort of clarity around that. But what about the seeming contradictions across the Gospels? We'll look at the Gospels. Now, I remember when I first sat down and read, I was newly saved, for the first time reading the New Testament. I was reading through Matthew, and then I got into Mark, into Luke, and one thing that really stood out to me was the fact that it's basically the same story. Like, I literally felt at times like, hang on, have I gone back a few pages? Like, I feel like I've read this before. The stories overall are really the same, down to the same core details. But as I sort of looked at them a bit closer, I did notice that there was little changes in some of the details of the story. So what's going on here? Why are there some slight variations across the Gospels when they're telling the same basic story, but some of the details change? What's some of the reasoning behind this? Does that mean that we can't trust the Gospels because they contradict themselves? Or is it because, well, again, in this sort of oral culture where traditions are passed down, maybe there is opportunity for variations to take place, which doesn't change the core details. And what you notice with all of these seeming contradictions is that the core details of the story never changed. Jesus came, he was born to a virgin, he lived as a teacher, and he was the teacher of the law, crucified on a Roman cross, and according to the gospel authors was resurrected. Those core details never changed. There is absolute agreement on that. Where we see these seeming contradictions are on the finer details within this parables or within the teachings themselves. So then, what's going on? Why are there some changes amongst these? Well, one explanation would be that Jesus was teaching the same message wherever he went. He was teaching the same parables wherever he went. So think about a preacher who is an itinerant preacher, and they've got maybe 2 or 3 sermons that they basically preach wherever they go. Now, you can preach the same sermon in 100 different churches, and it's the same sermon, but in 100 different churches, it's a brand new sermon. And so it's very easy for you to be able to do that time and time again. It's not like preaching in your own church where you've got to come up with a new message every week. You can use the same message time and time again because it's always going to be received by a new audience. But at the same time, there's no harm. The core, so long as the core of the message is the same, you can change some of the details, or you can, some of the anecdotes or some of the, metaphors that you use, you can certainly change. And that would be perfectly logical that that's what Jesus did. He's teaching these same parables, and the disciples would have been hearing the same stories and the same jokes day in and day out. They probably would have got sick of just hearing these same jokes and probably having to laugh at the same punchline time and time again. But for his audience, who's hearing for the first time, this is really profound stuff. But you can imagine for a teacher like Jesus doing this every day, then he might just for a change up some of the details. So, for example, in Matthew 25:14, you've got the parable of the talents. Now, this same story in Luke 19:11, we've got the parable of the 10 pounds. Now, it's the same core story, but we've changed currencies from talents to pounds. What's going on there? Well, it's just a variation in the story, and Luke has picked up a memorized tradition, which was the pounds tradition, and Matthew's tradition that's come down to him is the talents tradition. Maybe that was the one that Matthew heard, or maybe that's the one that stuck out to him. And Luke, who's got his message from Mark and from others, he's picked up a different tradition because somebody else has memorized that tradition and passed it down. But the core of the story remains the same. And so there is a variation. And, well, it's probably just that Jesus was doing something different that day because just to keep it exciting, at least for himself, not going verbatim the same story every single day. Now, another opportunity for variation is the fact that Jesus spoke Greek. That Jesus spoke Aramaic. And so then when we read our Gospels, they're translated into Greek. And so the translation from Aramaic into Greek, from memorized oral traditions memorized in Aramaic to then being translated on later on into Greek, into the different Gospels, is going to bring about opportunities for some slight nuances or slight change of certain terms. But again, none of this changes the core of the message, only maybe just a slight variation through the translation. But then even in the performance of these Gospels, now again, you've got to keep remembering in an oral culture, you don't just write these traditions down and then give them to people to go away and read and study for themselves. You have to perform them. You have to verbalize them. You teach them. And so the teachers who are passing these traditions on to the churches as the message is spreading around the world, they're performing them. They're presenting them in ways that are engaging to the audience. And so that performer himself, again, teaching the core of the story, but then through the process of the performance, maybe, just varying up some of the details just to make it a bit more engaging to that particular audience or a bit more culturally relevant to that particular audience that he's speaking to. So there's another opportunity there that there might just be these slight. Now, you can't pinpoint and say, that change in the gospel is because of this phenomenon over here, but these are all different ways in which you can find slight changes across the Gospels. But again, noting that the core details of the story absolutely don't change, that the faithfulness to that core story is absolutely 100%. Now, a good example of this is when you've got a different audience or a different cultural context that you're preaching to, you're going to preach in such a way, or you're going to use examples that are relevant to that particular audience, to their understanding. I remember when I was many years ago, we were up in the Kimberleys, up in northwestern Australia, and we're doing some outreach work up to the Aboriginal communities there. And they were saying to us, when you're praying for people, don't talk about, or prophesying over someone, you don't say that you're a pillar in the faith. Don't use this language which sort of represents more sort of Western architecture. Use language like you're a fence post, because that's what that community would understand. They understand how a fence works. They don't understand columns and pillars and these sorts of things. It just doesn't resonate as deeply. And so use language, use analogies that are appropriate, that are going to not cause a jarring to that particular audience. So we get a great example of this in Mark. So it's the story of when they're trying to lower the cripple down through the roof to see Jesus and to be healed by him. And so in Mark's account, it's in Mark 2 verses 4, they talk about the roofing material and that they dug through the roof. Now it doesn't specifically say what the material was, but the digging through is because what you're talking about is a roof made of grass material. So in and around Judea and around Galilee, the way that the houses are made, the roofing material is grass. It's straw. So what you would do is you would have wooden slats to hold the grass on there, and then you would lay layers and layers of straw, and then you would sort of hold it all together with mud, and that created for you a waterproof roof. That's how the roofing structure was made. But then when Luke tells that story in Luke 5:19, he changes the detail of it to say that they removed the tiles. Now, why does he change the detail to tiles? Well, because his Greek audience don't use grass or hay roofing material, they use tiles. You can still go and see so many of these tiles still on these archaeological sites because they were mass produced. So that's audience wouldn't understand digging through the roof because they're thinking, how do you dig through these porcelain tiles? That just sounds, no, you break through them at the very least, or you remove the tile. So he's changing a detail to suit his audience. Now, the core of the story doesn't change. There was a man who was crippled and he was lowered down through the roof, but what Luke doesn't want to do is create a situation where they're going, what do you mean by digging through? And then actually miss the point of the story. Let's keep the story going, or keep the details familiar to you so that you're not tripped up by something that's actually irrelevant to the actual point of the story, which in this case was the guy being lowered down and being healed by Jesus. Now then, at other times, different historians, different writers we talked about these bioi, these lives, when they're writing down the stories, they're writing down stories in a way, structuring stories in a way that are easily readable, that are smooth flowing, like any good storyteller. They're not going to, they're going to try to write in a way that is going to keep their audiences engaged with the detail. And so if a story is very long-winded and with a lot of unnecessary detail, then you'll trim that story down, or you'll smooth it out in such a way that it fits within the general flow of the story. And so what you're going to find in the Gospels is, in one Gospel, you might find a long, detailed version of the story, but then in another Gospel, you get a shortened version, because for that particular author, the details of the story aren't as important. The secondary details aren't as important to the main point. And so let's just focus on the main point so we can move on with the general flow of the narrative. So that sort of smoothing out in storytelling is absolutely normal. You're going to find this through all of the ancient sort of biographies that we find, because again, this is what just good storytellers do. They'll tell stories in a way that keep the audience engaged and keep them moving forward. So again, a very standard technique that we're going to find throughout the Gospels. Now, another good example of this is where over time, as the Gospel authors are coming to put to paper their accounts, they're going to bring the story up into their time. So a really great example of this actually is found in Matthew. Now, Matthew's one of our later Gospels, probably written in the 80s, and it's written to a very specific Jewish audience. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But Matthew has a particular audience in mind, but what he's also doing is that he's writing to a very well-established church community, and a church community that's changed quite significantly from the original early church. Certainly after the collapse of Jerusalem in 70, the destruction of the temple, Jewish and Christian relationships were pretty much destroyed. And so the whole Christian context was very different now. And so Matthew is writing a gospel into that context and trying to bring aspects of Jesus that are relevant to that part of the story. But at other times, expanding some of the traditions that have started off as a basic tradition in the time of Jesus to becoming something much more developed and appropriate to that church community. Now, not in any way changing what Jesus has said or contradicting what Jesus has said, but only like every school. I mean, you think about every philosophical school is going to have the basic teaching of their original founder, but then as the generations go on and as the time and the cultures change, you're going to develop them. You're going to unpack them more in the same way that the Pharisees had their own oral traditions from Torah. Torah was good for Moses in his time, written, about a time when the Jews are living in the desert. Much of that is irrelevant now that we're in the Roman Empire. And so we need to unpack these, still faithful to the original message, but unpack them in a way that's relevant to the time that we're living in. So in the same way, some of these traditions would have been developed to be more appropriate to the needs of the community at the time. So again, a great example of this comes from Matthew 18, and it's a passage you're familiar with. I'll read it out. It says, "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector." Now, again, it's a story you're going to be familiar with, or it's a passage you're going to be familiar with. But one of the clues to the fact that it's not probably something Jesus said word for word is the fact that he talks about the church. There was no church in Jesus' time. That didn't exist yet. That doesn't come till much later on. So the Greek word ekklesia doesn't start to even be employed until at least the 40s AD, well after the ministry of Jesus. So the fact that Matthew is putting into the mouth of Jesus this word church or ecclesia is a clear sign that Matthew is taking what was that original tradition and sort of drawing it out to where they are today, to what it's become, but still faithful to what that original tradition was. So where this sort of stems back to, the tradition that sort of evolves here would have gone back to actually Leviticus. So Leviticus 19:7 says, "Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so you will not share in their guilt." So it's a simple disciplinary procedure that has been long established back in Torah. And there's another passage in there actually in Deuteronomy that talks about having 2 or 3 witnesses. So these are very important elements of the Jewish legal system. When we come to Luke 17, that probably captures something more of the original tradition as Jesus would have had it, where Luke says in Luke 17:3, it says, "If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them." That's probably much closer to what Jesus said, in that he's drawing directly from this Levitical tradition. But then when we get to Matthew, writing into a context where this has become the standard practice of giving 3 warnings, requiring 3 witnesses, that's the practice that they're most familiar with. And so in his retelling of the story, putting it back into Jesus' mouth to give it that authority, this is certainly something Jesus would have endorsed, but at the time was unnecessary. And so where we've got to now with this tradition is this. And so you're going to get a few things like that, some examples of that where you're going to right into a contemporary audience, you need to keep the ideas and the teachings contemporary as well. But at the same time, it's obviously recognizable that this is not word for word what Jesus would have said, because Jesus would never have talked about an ecclesia. So that's obvious, and he's not trying to hide it. He's not trying to manipulate and make Jesus say what he wouldn't have otherwise said, but only to say that this fits in with that original tradition. So there are lots of different ways in which we can read our 4 Gospels, read the same stories, but with slight variations in the details. And what you need to notice is that all of the variations, all of the so-called contradictions, are not really contradictions. They're just variations of the same story. They're just slight changes in the details for any number of different reasons for why those changes could have come about. What is more remarkable about the Gospels, and I said this last week, what is most remarkable about the Gospels is how remarkably consistent they are. Is in the fact that, and considering the space of time between, say, Mark's gospel in maybe 70 and John's gospel maybe in the late 80s, even early 90s, over maybe a 2-decade span, and 4 gospels that are written in 4 different parts of the world by 4 different authors to 4 different audiences, the fact that they're so remarkably similar is really quite astounding. If you consider the argument, if it was true to say that from the earliest church, they spread these stories and then like Chinese whispers, they changed and evolved. And if that was the case, then within only a few years, you would have 100 different variations of the story, deep deep variations of the story, almost contradicting variations in different parts of the empire as this story has been spread and changed and evolved, you would find that by the time 40, 50 years after the events, when these Gospels have been written, they would be absolutely unrecognizable stories. The four Gospels would not even be, if you put them together, you couldn't even imagine they were talking about the same thing. If it was the case that these stories were just a collection of Chinese whispers, what we need to take a step back and recognize is that over 4 or 5 decades from all over the Roman Empire, in all of these different communities, these stories are sort of popping up in different parts of the world and being written down, and they're all being written down basically as the same story. You can't even collaborate that. It's not like they could sit down, it's not like they had a Zoom call and, Matthew talking to Luke and Mark and saying, all right, so we're going to write these stories. Let's make sure that they all line up. No, they're not even, that's not even close to that. As we're going to see later on, the Gospels are written even long after the first one of Mark. So that reality, again, that they're popping up all over the world at all these different times and yet still saying the same thing actually proves much more the commitment that this community had to memory, the commitment that these people had to memorizing these details with absolute accuracy and with absolute faithfulness to the original traditions that where these stories first came from. All right, so what we were sort of looking for here then is the original source. Where did these stories start? These stories have spread out over time through the Roman Empire and have popped up at different times and ended up in our Gospels. Where did they start? Both chronologically, but also geographically, where did these stories start? Well, the geography is obvious. They started in Jerusalem. They started immediately after the ascension of Christ, where his followers said, all right, we need to remember, we need to write down, we need to make sure that we remember faithfully what it was that he told us. And so there would have been an initial collaboration to collect together all of their stories, all of their key teachings. And again, we've heard the same parables taught 100 different times, so let's make sure that we have these. And they probably would have written those ones down. They probably would have taken these deep, long sermons that Jesus would have taught, like the Sermon on the Mount. That Sermon on the Mount might take only 5 minutes to read, but it would have been a couple of hours worth of sermon. And so what we're doing is we're basically collecting the notes from that, or we're making a very truncated version of the key points, remembering though that unpacking that was a much longer, much more profound sermon. And so they're going to have these bigger memories, these larger traditions that they would be committed, but what they would write down would be these smaller bite-sized versions that are easier to commit to memory, but are attached to these bigger memories. I hope that's making sense, but you've got this much bigger idea that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of space to write down, but by just giving you this small piece and then giving you the rest of it to memorize, that's going to be enough to trigger all of that memory. So that's probably what they would have written down. And so what we have then is a collection of these short stories, these parables, these teachings, that those are the parts they would have then started to spread. And so they would have authorized teachers to take those out into the world to spread those. And that would have been the original disciples, but then their students as well, because this message has to get out quickly. So the original source then of the stories was, of course, the disciples, the ones who had been there, who had committed it to memory, who'd agreed on what the traditions are, who'd agreed on what the core message was, and then would have written down those snippets and then passed them on. But they would have also drawn on other sources, people like Lazarus, who would have still been around. He was not that long ago brought back to life. And so we're going to talk to him and make sure that we get his faithful account of what took place there. Or we're going to go and talk to blind Bartimaeus, who, funnily enough, isn't blind anymore. And so all of these different people who've had their own encounters with Christ, where we see those stories turn up, they would have been the original eyewitnesses of those stories because they were the ones who experienced it, and they would have been the ones that the disciples would have gone and spoken to get their story, to make sure that they've understood it correctly, and then incorporated that into all of their traditions. So there would have just been a number of different sources that they would have drawn on to make sure that we've got this set of teachings, this set of traditions that we all agree on, and that's going to be what the core of this gospel message is, and that's what we're going to take out into the world. Now, what is essential for us to remember in all of this is that what we have in these traditions goes back to the original sources, people who saw Jesus. That is the priority. That is where the authority comes from. Jesus himself is the authority. And so his students who've memorized these traditions are the trustworthy sources of these. And so if you want to find out that the core message of the gospel, those are the guys you're going to go and talk to. Now, you might hear it from a teacher all the way up in Rome. Somebody might have been sent from Jerusalem to Rome and they're teaching you that message. If you want to go back to the source, you still can in that first generation go back to Jerusalem and talk to the apostles and say, hey, tell me about your own experience of this. I've heard these traditions, you tell me. So that's what I saw, and that's what's been spread out. So you would have had these authorized teachers who are coming from Jerusalem and then going out and making sure that who are teaching faithfully, and entrusted teachers who are not trying to manipulate the story or trying to make it to their advantage, because it certainly wasn't. The story of a crucified Messiah is absolutely disgraceful, but people that they can trust, people that can pass on this message. And in fact, we see an example of this with Paul. When Paul's writing to the Galatians, he talks about a time where after many years of preaching, he'd heard these traditions, he'd memorized them as well, but after many years of preaching, he himself goes back to Jerusalem for about 13 days, and he hangs out with most likely Peter and James for the most of the time, and just to check in with them, just to make sure that his gospel still lined up with theirs. Not that he was not confident that he was telling something different. He knew he was telling the right story, but just to make sure that he's still lined up with them. And at the same time, they agree that he's going to be the apostle to the Gentiles, Peter will be the apostle to the Jews, and all of those things take place. But again, we see even Paul himself, going back to Jerusalem just to check in with the original source, with James, who's back in Jerusalem and is effectively sort of the keeper of the traditions and the keeper of these original stories. And so again, then it's these stories that are spreading out. It's these stories that are going out into the world. And with every new Christian community that emerges through the Roman Empire, their foundation are these traditions. And so we see them popping up, as we saw. We saw Paul going out into Corinth and passing on as of first importance these traditions, the one that he says in communion, and then again the one in Corinthians 15 when he's talking about the death and resurrection of Christ. These are the memorized traditions with all of the stories attached to them. We can see them at work already in Paul's ministry very early on, and that's exactly how it has been passed on throughout the time. Now, we're going to finish up for this week, and we're going to pick up our story next week, how all of this came together, only to say that after a while, there was a recognition that Jesus hasn't come back yet, that our original sources for these Gospels, Peter, James, John, all these guys, they're getting pretty old, and some of them are being martyred. Like their memories are going to perish with them. Jesus isn't back yet. Maybe it's time for us to actually write some of these down, collect some of these stories together, that we can at least ensure that they're preserved until Jesus comes back, so that the generations to come will still have these original sources that can be traced back all the way to Jerusalem. And so that's then the story of the construction of these Gospels, how these Gospels came to be, and the 4 Gospels that we now have today. So we don't have time for that today. We're going to look at that next week. But otherwise, thank you for being here. Hope you've had a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.